Hello, my name is Pete Lee. I'm a state representative in the Colorado General Assembly. It was the summer of 1986 in South Africa, in a ghetto known as Guguleto. Riots erupted in the streets protesting the government's policy of apartheid. And in the middle of the riots, a man named Mangazi Mangini spotted an American running through the crowd. Her name was Amy Beale. She was an American Fulbright scholar who had been working and studying in South Africa for a year. Mangazi confessed to what he did next. "I tripped her," he said. "She fell down. I got a knife and I stabbed her. I know it was my wound that killed her." Mangazi was sentenced to prison for the remainder of his life. But that's not the end of the story. 8 years later, Mangazi faced the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. He was applying for amnesty. Meanwhile, Amy Beale's parents came to Johannesburg and met with Mangazi's mother in her home in the Black Township. She read a letter that Amy had written before the riots. Amy expressed her appreciation for Nelson Mandela. "Though the policies of apartheid have devastated this country," she wrote, "the creation of community will be just as difficult, but it is the only path." Mrs. Mangini and Amy's parents shared a mutual anguish over the loss of their children. The Beales listened closely as Mangini made a public statement in which he took full responsibility for the death of their daughter and expressed his deep remorse. The Beales decided to support Mangini in his quest for amnesty, and today, the Beales and Mangazi are working together in a foundation to build community in South Africa, the kind of community that Amy foresaw. What took place in the hearts and souls of Amy Beale's parents? How could they forgive their daughter's killer? What expansion of consciousness prompted this profound transformation from anger, hatred, and a desire for retribution to working side by side? It's what we call restorative justice. Although our challenges here differ from South Africa as it emerged from apartheid, we too face the crisis of a divided nation, a nation where mass incarceration is endemic, where the vestiges of Jim Crow are still manifest in our criminal justice system. Restorative justice can help us as it did in South Africa. Before I share with you about restorative justice, I would like to tell you a little bit about how I reached this place. I'm a newly elected Colorado state representative, and I'm finishing my first term, so I'm still a rookie with a lot to learn. During this first term as a state representative, I wrote and sponsored a bill for restorative justice, House Bill 11-1032. That bill was signed right here in the Pioneers Museum courtroom in Colorado Springs. This bill was an attempt to make fundamental reforms in the criminal justice system of Colorado. Before I was a state representative, I was a businessman, a practicing lawyer in Colorado Springs for 35 years, as well as a community volunteer. Part of my practice was representing indigent criminal defendants. I was appointed to represent them by the local judges. During my years of working with criminal defendants, I saw some who had learned from their mistakes, paid their price to society, made changes, and went on to live productive lives. I also saw many more who didn't. They were angry at the prosecutor, the courts, the system, the victim, and me. They blamed everyone for their situation. Many refused to look in the mirror. Having worked in this criminal justice system for many years, I know personally that our system is operated by some of the brightest, most hardworking, diligent, and conscientious people around. They sincerely care. They give of themselves beyond measure, and they are fervently committed to making the system operate with justice and humanity. Their work is supplemented by hundreds of volunteers who are committed to community. But despite all of this, it became clear to me that the system was not working. Colorado has one of the highest incarceration rates in the world, higher than such dictatorships as Pakistan and Libya, higher than every Western democracy. In Colorado, certain prison sentences are unnecessarily long. There's too little treatment for alcohol and drug addictions that are endemic in prisons. And when it comes to minorities, we have a disproportionately high incarceration rate. 1 out of every 7 African Americans is under some court sanction, jail, probation, or parole. Although minorities represent 20% of the population, they represent almost half of our inmates. Our costs for incarceration are escalating and unsustainable. We now spend $33,000 to keep one person in prison for 1 year. By comparison, we spend $6,000 to educate each student in kindergarten through high school. Here in Colorado, we spend more on corrections than higher education. That raises the important question: what kind of society spends more on cages than classrooms? We have an unacceptably high recidivism rate in Colorado. 52% of releasees return to prison within 3 years. We release inmates who are unrepentant, unrehabilitated, and unprepared to return to their communities. Meanwhile, we keep feeding the system. High school dropouts are more prone to crime. That spells trouble for Colorado. A full 1/3 of our high school students quit before graduation. Less than 50% of minority students graduated. Since the Columbine shootings, we have referred 100,000 students to law enforcement for in-school offenses. We're resorting to suspension and expulsion far too often, resulting in even more dropouts. We rely too heavily on punishment rather than rehabilitation and restoration. As a result, our future as an educated state is in jeopardy. I've seen this firsthand as I've worked in the criminal justice system and in schools. I became convinced we've got to try something different. We need to break the cycle and the recycling of people. We need to move from punishment and retribution to collaboration and restoration. Restorative justice is something different, and we know that it works. Restorative justice focuses on accepting responsibility and repairing the harm to victims and the community. It looks at criminal defenses as a breach of the relationship between the offender and the victim, and a breach between the offender and the community. Restorative justice gives offenders the opportunity to repair those relationships by meeting face-to-face with their victims. With one-on-one conferences guided by a facilitator, an offender can hear firsthand how his offense impacted the victim and hear it directly from the victim. The offender also hears about the impact on the community from people in the community. I have participated in hundreds of these victim offender conferences, and I can tell you from my experience, for most offenders, the experience is transformative. The offenders change because they develop empathy. They walk in the shoes of their victims. They become accountable for their actions. They accept responsibility for what they did, and they're given the chance to repair the harm to the victim and the community. And here's one of the strongest supports for restorative justice. The recidivism rate is less than 10%. Victims and offenders both report high levels of satisfaction with the fairness of the process and with the results. I have seen offenders look their victims in the eye in restorative justice conferences and say, "I am sorry." That is something I rarely heard from my clients in the criminal justice system. In return, I have heard victims say something to offenders that I have never heard as a criminal defense lawyer. "I forgive you." Empathy, apologies, and forgiveness are the beginning of true transformation and healing. Restorative justice works in part, I believe, because it addresses what I perceive to be the shortcomings in the criminal justice system. First, restorative justice treats offenders with respect. It recognizes they are not bad people, but people who have committed bad acts. It separates them from their bad acts. Second, restorative justice puts victims in the center of the process. This is far different from our conventional system, which makes victims peripheral. Third, restorative justice does not rely on punishment to change behavior. Punishment and fear can alter behavior, but it is not lifelong, nor is it transformative. Finally, restorative justice is consistent with the basic principles of human nature. It's what sociologist Abraham Maslow, in his hierarchy of needs, called belongingness, the innate social need to belong to a community. Restorative justice recognizes that we live in an interdependent world, a community, and that most of us want to be part of that community, to belong. We start out belonging to our families, to our schools, our sports teams, our churches, or for some, to gangs. In those communities, we expect safety and support, and we give them back in equal measure. When we are thinking clearly, we don't hurt our own family or members of our communities because we know them and we feel empathy for them. Restorative justice proceeds from this premise, and it succeeds because it recognizes offenders as people who have committed bad acts, then provides them with a community to hold them accountable, to help them accept responsibility for their actions. Finally, it gives them an opportunity to repair the harm to the victim and the community so they can rejoin the community as fully participating partners. A wise man once said that the way a man leaves his community is the way he will return. In our conventional system, we humiliate offenders by treating them as bad people. We dress them in orange suits, we identify them by number rather than a name. Then we send them off to remote prisons, separated from their family, from their friends, from their community. It's no wonder they return with anger and resentment and no sense of belonging to that community. The bill I presented to the Colorado legislature made restorative justice and victim offender conferences widely available in Colorado. We made restorative justice available to juveniles, to adults, to school children, and with a small pilot program in the Department of Corrections and Department of Youth Corrections. By enacting House Bill 11-1032, Colorado has moved into the forefront of states with innovative approaches to criminal justice. We are now among a handful of states that allow restorative justice victim offender dialogues in prison. This bill passed the legislature unanimously and was signed by the governor right here in the Pioneers Museum Courthouse in Colorado Springs. I am proud to say that Colorado has adopted restorative justice. Restorative justice could be a game changer. It could be the most significant bill coming out of the 68th General Assembly. It could transform our criminal justice system from one of incarceration and retribution to one of responsibility, reparation, and healing. It could empower victims to change their stories from anger, resentment, and retribution to forgiveness and restoration. It could stop the school-to-prison pipeline for our children. It could break the cycle of crime and end the revolving door to prison. It could increase graduation rates and lower dropout rates. It could lower prison budgets. Restorative justice could reverse the negative trends in our system so that we can spend more on classrooms than cages, more on textbooks than prison blocks. Restorative justice could do all these things, but it won't unless you, the people, insist that we use restorative justice in our courts and in our schools. The courts and the schools belong to us, the people. When they are not working, we must insist upon change. And right now, they are not working. Not when 1/3 of our kids fail to graduate from high school. Not when 50% of inmates return to prison. Restorative justice is the change we need, where it is used when offenders accept responsibility and begin to feel empathy. This is the beginning of transformation. If we can transform offenders one by one, it will lower recidivism, reduce rearrests, promote individual responsibility, and save money. Restorative justice can empower victims to begin healing from crime. We owe them that. For too long, victims have been peripheral to the process. They need to be at the center. With this bill, victims drive the process. Tell your friends and your neighbors. Tell those who are victims of crime to request restorative justice. Tell the victims to notify the district attorneys that they want to meet with their offenders, to participate in the setting of consequences. It is now their right to do so. Tell the prosecutors, the defense lawyers, the judges, and the magistrates that you want them to use restorative justice because restorative justice works. It reduces recidivism. It makes our communities safer. Tell the teachers, the principals, and the school boards to use restorative justice in the schools. Use it to keep kids in school, to facilitate learning, and to increase graduation rates. Use it to stop the cycle of expulsion, suspension, and dropping out. The time for restorative justice has come.